Seattle, 1990. Cold case solved, arrest shocks the community. That headline hit local news feeds before dawn, but the story behind it had been waiting 34 years to be told. A single brown wool glove, sealed in plastic since 1990, finally gave up a fragment of DNA. That fragment led detectives to a retired mechanic named Raymond Hoffman, 68, living quietly in Tacoma. Before sunrise, he was in handcuffs. By noon, the city that had long whispered about the nurse who vanished by Green Lake knew the name of her killer. It ended where it began, in the fog and cedar air of the Pacific Northwest. Police moved fast. They surrounded Hoffman's small duplex near the port. Neighbors heard the knock, saw the flashing lights, stepped outside, clutching coffee mugs as officers led an old man across the wet pavement. The air smelled of rain and diesel. Hoffman didn't resist. He didn't even ask why. He just looked down and held out his wrists. Inside the precinct, cold case detective Ryan Sullivan signed the intake papers. He had been chasing the genetic profile for months. A partial male DNA signature pulled from that forgotten glove found near the trail at Green Lake Park. The same trail where nurse Margaret Voigt had gone missing on September 12, 1990. For decades, her case had sat in an archive box marked unsolved. Now it had a name, and that name came from science. The glove had been recovered 50 yards from the path, bagged before volunteers flooded the area, and sealed under chain of custody. That early step mattered. It ruled out contamination, ruled out incidental contact, ruled out the excuse that always comes when DNA appears decades later. For 29 years, the sample was too weak to test. Then, in 2019, Sullivan's team sent it to a private lab in California that specialized in extracting genetic material from degraded fibers. Technicians used touch DNA methods unheard of in the 90s. Under a microscope, they lifted the cells that had survived inside the lining of the glove. The sequence was partial but clear enough to build a profile. It went into a genealogy database. Weeks later, a pattern emerged: distant relatives with German ancestry centered in Washington state. A genealogist spent 60 hours tracing that family tree backward through census records and marriage certificates, until the branches narrowed to one living descendant who matched the age, location, and background the detectives needed to see. Raymond Hoffman. He had lived 3 miles from Green Lake when Margaret disappeared. He had driven a dark blue Chevrolet Blazer, just like the one an elderly witness had described in 1990, but whose report had been misfiled for decades. Everything aligned. Sullivan watched Hoffman for 2 weeks. The man followed a quiet routine: grocery store runs, cigarettes on the porch, early bedtimes. One night, Hoffman smoked outside a convenience store and flicked his butt into a trash can. Sullivan waited until he walked away, then retrieved the cigarette with gloved hands and sealed it in an evidence bag. It went to the same lab. 3 days later, the call came. The DNA from the cigarette matched the DNA from the glove. Probability of coincidence, 1 in 1 quadrillion. That's as certain as science can speak. By sunrise, a warrant was in hand. By mid-morning, Hoffman was arrested for the abduction and murder of Margaret Voigt. The announcement hit Seattle like an aftershock. Margaret's daughter, Emily, now in her 40s, read the alert on her phone before work. She stared at the name. She whispered it once, then again, as if saying it could make sense of the years she'd lived without answers. At police headquarters, Sullivan faced reporters. He said what detectives say when technology finally breaks a wall that human memory could not. No case is too old, no evidence too small. Behind the microphones, he was already thinking about the chain that had carried this fragment through time. The officer who found the glove near the trail. The clerk who filed the report that got lost. The archivist who never threw it away. And now, a new method: forensic genealogy that could read stories trapped in dust and fiber. Forensic genealogy works by matching crime scene DNA to the open-source family trees built by ordinary people searching for ancestors. When a partial profile shares DNA with living relatives, genealogists can reverse engineer a suspect list, trimming branches until one person fits the right window of age, geography, and opportunity. It is slow, meticulous work, but it is rewriting what cold means in cold cases. That is how a nurse who vanished into fog in 1990 found her voice again in 2024. The science doesn't resurrect the dead, but it does something almost as rare. It restores truth to families who stopped expecting it. The arrest also reopened wounds in a city that had nearly forgotten her name. For older Seattleites, the story brought back memories of flyers stapled to telephone poles, of morning jogs taken with a friend instead of alone, of the eerie feeling that someone out there knew exactly what happened and would never be caught. Now, that someone had a face. But it wasn't triumph that filled the room when detectives told Emily Voigt. It was silence. Because while the arrest brought answers, her mother's body was still missing. Hoffman confessed, later, that he had buried her somewhere east of the city, along logging roads that had since been cut and paved over. He claimed he couldn't find the spot again. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just the last cruelty he could control. Still, the case had broken open. 34 years of not knowing collapsed into one name and one chain of evidence, built from the smallest thing a glove kept for no reason other than protocol. It is strange how justice moves. Sometimes it is loud, sometimes it is just a whisper in a lab. In this case, it was the soft click of a centrifuge in a cold case unit at the edge of Seattle, the hum of a computer parsing genomes, the voice of a detective reading the words he had been waiting to say. We have a match. And that is where we begin, with a city that thought it had moved on, a daughter who never stopped asking, and an old man who believed he had gotten away with murder. If you like cases where one overlooked clue flips a whole town, you're in the right place. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it began. Before her name became a headline, before the words "Seattle nurse missing" echoed through radio newscasts, Margaret Voigt was just another early riser in a city that loved its rituals. It was the fall of 1990, and Seattle still moved at a slower rhythm then. Starbucks had fewer than 50 stores. The skyline was a patchwork of cranes and fog. On September mornings, the air smelled of wet cedar and exhaust, and the first joggers circled Green Lake Park under a pale mist that blurred the water and the trees into one soft gray line. Margaret belonged to that hour, the quiet between night shift and rush hour. Every Wednesday, she woke before dawn, laced up her running shoes, and slipped out of the house while her husband and daughter still slept. To understand what her disappearance did to this town, you have to know who she was. Margaret was 34, a registered nurse at Swedish Medical Center. Her co-workers described her as steady, the kind of person who made other people calm. She was small, 5'4", with sharp eyes and a voice that could cut through the chaos of an emergency room without ever sounding harsh. She'd been working oncology for 6 years, and the families she helped often wrote her letters. She kept them in a shoebox under her bed. She lived with her husband, Paul, and their 7-year-old daughter, Emily, in a narrow craftsman house near Green Lake, just north of downtown. The house had peeling paint, a red front door, and a little garden that never quite grew the way she wanted. Paul was a software engineer at a small tech startup downtown, one of those early companies that talked about networks and data storage years before anyone cared. They weren't wealthy, but they were content. On weekends, Margaret took Emily to the farmer's market near Pike Place, where they bought apples and fresh bread. Paul stayed home, fixing things that didn't need fixing. They were ordinary. That's what made it unbearable later, how ordinary everything was before it broke. Seattle in 1990 was on the edge of transformation. The city still felt like a secret, rain-soaked and restless, not yet swallowed by the tech boom. There were mom-and-pop diners on every corner and record stores that stayed open past midnight. The air buzzed with something new. Grunge was coming, but no one knew what to call it yet. Green Lake Park sat like a calm mirror at the center of it all. 3 miles of paved trail wrapped around the water, a magnet for joggers, strollers, and dog walkers. People said it was the safest place in the city. You could see the Space Needle from certain parts of the trail if the fog lifted. Families picnicked there on Sundays. Police patrolled the area mostly for parking violations and the occasional lost child. No one thought of danger when they thought of Green Lake. Margaret did the same loop every week counterclockwise, starting near the north parking lot, the one closest to their house. She usually wore gray sweatpants, a green windbreaker, and her white running shoes with blue swooshes. That morning, though, she left in a different pair, the older ones. The detail puzzled everyone later. She carried pepper spray in her jacket pocket, though her husband had never seen her use it. She didn't jog with music. She liked to listen to the sound of her breath, the slap of her shoes against the pavement. It was her time to think. Her shift at the hospital didn't start until 11, so the early morning run was her private ritual, the only part of the day that belonged entirely to her. When she left that morning, she kissed Emily on the forehead and whispered, "See you after school, kiddo." Those were the last words her daughter ever heard from her. The Voigt family had moved to Seattle in 1984, chasing stability. Paul had landed the software job, and Margaret had transferred from a hospital in Portland. They bought their house near the lake because it felt safe. The neighborhood was lined with trees and bicycle racks, kids played in the street, and the biggest worry was whether the local bakery would run out of croissants by noon. Their neighbors still remember that morning. Mrs. Faye Winton, who lived next door, told reporters later that she saw Margaret's porch light turn off at 5:30. She'd been watering her front garden, like she did every morning, and she saw Margaret jog past, waving once, smiling. She looked like she always did, Faye said. Calm, awake, like she was already halfway through her day. No one saw her after that. Inside the house, Paul woke later than usual. He'd stayed up debugging code for a project that was supposed to launch the following week. When he came downstairs at 7:15, the house felt too quiet. Margaret's coffee mug was still on the counter, half full, the toast she'd made for breakfast sitting uneaten on a plate. The front door was slightly open. He thought maybe she'd stopped to talk to a neighbor or gone back out for something she forgot. But the minutes stretched. Then the hours. At 8, he called her hospital, maybe she'd gone in early. She hadn't. At 9, he drove to Green Lake and parked near the north lot, expecting to find her car. It was there. He walked the loop himself, calling her name. By 10, he was sitting in the living room with 2 uniformed officers, describing her height, her clothes, her route, every detail he could remember. His hands shook the entire time. Word spread fast. Seattle was still small enough for a missing person to feel personal. By noon, Margaret's photo was on the local radio. By dusk, volunteers filled the park. Police dogs traced her scent along the paved loop, past the boathouse, into the north parking lot, and then it stopped. Just stopped. No torn fabric, no blood, no sign of struggle. It was as if she had stepped into the mist and disappeared. The police set up floodlights that night. Flashlights swept through brush and reeds. Helicopters circled overhead. Reporters arrived, calling the story the Green Lake Mystery. Seattle had seen disappearances before, but this one hit differently. Margaret wasn't transient or reckless. She was a nurse, a wife, a mother. She had a morning routine, a family waiting. It didn't make sense. Detective Frank Callahan, 12 years on the force, took the lead. He was tired, practical, the kind of cop who still carried a notepad and drank too much black coffee. He stood near the edge of the parking lot that first night and told a colleague, if she was taken, it was quick. The next morning, the Voigt house filled with people, family, neighbors, co-workers, bringing casseroles they couldn't imagine Paul eating. 7-year-old Emily sat in the hallway, hugging her stuffed rabbit, asking if mommy was coming home. Her grandmother told her yes, but her eyes said no. Inside the precinct, Callahan's team started the checklist. Spouse cleared, at least for now. Co-workers interviewed. Known sex offenders in the area cross-referenced. Tips, logged by hand. Every one of them followed until they collapsed. A week later, the media had a name for it: the Green Lake Vanishing. Seattle was a different place by then. The fog over the lake had become a stage light for grief. Volunteers gathered each morning. Search dogs came and went. Police dredged parts of the lake, found nothing but waterlogged debris. Theories spread like wildfire. A stalker, a random drifter, a jealous coworker. Some said Margaret had run away, but no one who knew her believed it. Her paycheck from Swedish Medical Center was never touched. Her car keys, wallet, and house were untouched. What lingered wasn't just fear, it was disbelief. Because people like Margaret didn't just vanish. For the next year, her face stayed taped to telephone poles. At the Green Lake Community Center, volunteers kept a bulletin board of leads, newspaper clippings, sketches, and lists of license plates. Every September, on the anniversary of her disappearance, someone added new flowers near the trail. By the 3rd year, only Paul and little Emily still came. Detective Callahan aged with the case. He kept Margaret's photo pinned above his desk, long after his captain told him to let it go. He couldn't. There was no closure, only quiet. And in a city that measured itself in rain, that quiet became part of the weather. For the people who lived near Green Lake, the story never truly left. Joggers changed their routes. Parents told their daughters to run in pairs. Every time fog rolled in thick enough to hide the water, someone thought of her. Seattle moved on, but the case never did. In time, the city grew shiny and rich. Its old neighborhoods rebuilt into condos and cafes. Its population doubled. But near the north parking lot of Green Lake Park, there's still a plaque, small, easy to miss, that reads, "In memory of Margaret Voigt, beloved mother, daughter, and nurse, missing since September 12, 1990, never forgotten." When Detective Ryan Sullivan opened her file nearly 30 years later, that plaque was already streaked with moss. The pages inside the box smelled of paper dust and time. He wasn't even born when Margaret disappeared, but something about her case stopped him cold: the clean timeline, the complete lack of answers. He ran his finger over the evidence log and saw the entry. Item 47 to 2 brown wool glove. No analysis conducted. And that's where the story began again. Because in Seattle, time doesn't erase anything. It just waits under the fog. Margaret Voigt wasn't supposed to be a mystery. She was supposed to finish her shift, drive home, and help her daughter build a cardboard castle for school. But that's what makes her story linger. It isn't about the danger we expect. It's about the danger that lives quietly next door, unnoticed, until the day it takes something from us. Before the DNA, before the confession, before the trial. There was just a nurse who went for a run and never came back. And a city that would spend 3 decades wondering what happened to her. September 12, 1990. Seattle woke under a thin veil of fog. The kind that blurred headlights and made the world seem quieter than it really was. At 5:30 in the morning, Margaret Voigt laced her shoes in the half-light of her kitchen. She moved softly, careful not to wake her family. The coffee pot gurgled. Steam curled against the window. Outside, a few early joggers passed beneath the street lamp glow, their footfalls muffled by mist. She tied her hair into the loose ponytail her daughter called the nurse knot. No Walkman, no jewelry, just a windbreaker, sweatpants, and those old white sneakers. She slipped out the front door, closed it halfway, the latch didn't catch, and started her run toward Green Lake Park, 3 blocks east. It was the kind of morning that looked exactly like all the others. That was the tragedy of it. There was no sign that anything was about to go wrong. Inside, Paul Voigt stirred in his sleep. He'd been up late writing code for a deadline. When his alarm finally buzzed at 7:15, he hit snooze twice. By the time he sat up, the light in the room had changed full daylight now, the kind that means you're running behind. He shuffled to the kitchen, expecting to see his wife stretching by the counter, red-faced from her run, teasing him for oversleeping. But the house was still. The coffee she'd brewed sat cooling on the table. Her toast was half-eaten. The front door hung slightly open. He called her name once, then again, louder. No answer. He stepped onto the porch, looked up and down the street. Nothing but sprinklers ticking, and a dog barking somewhere 2 houses away. The first edge of panic caught his chest. At 7:45, he called her hospital. A woman at Swedish Medical checked the schedule. "Margaret's shift starts at 11, she said. "Right," Paul told her. "She went for a run. She should have been back by now." The woman hesitated, not sure what he was asking. Paul hung up before she could answer. He told himself there had to be a reason. Maybe she ran longer. Maybe she stopped for coffee. He checked the garage. Her car was still there. Checked the backyard. Nothing. At 8, he drove to Green Lake. The park was just starting to fill joggers, dog walkers, an old man fishing near the boathouse. He parked near the north lot, the one closest to their house, and scanned the trail. No sign of her. He walked the 3-mile loop once, calling her name. No answer. By 9, he was back in the car, hands shaking against the steering wheel. He dialed the Seattle Police Department. "I think my wife's missing," he said. The dispatcher asked how long she'd been gone. "About 4 hours," he said. There was a pause. Then she said she'd send an officer. When the first patrol car arrived, Paul was sitting on the porch steps, eyes fixed on the road. The officers were polite, but detached. Missing adults usually turned up by lunch. They took notes while Paul talked, her route, her clothes, her usual pace. "She runs the same loop every Wednesday," he said. She's careful. She never talks to strangers." He tried to keep his voice even, but it cracked on the word never. The officers nodded, scribbling on their pads. One of them, Officer David Renner, asked the standard questions. Had they been fighting? Was she under stress? Had she ever disappeared before? Paul said no to all of them. Renner called the precinct, reported a missing person. By 10, the search had begun. Volunteers gathered fast. Seattle was still a small-town city back then. News traveled on coffee shop, bulletin boards, and early morning radio. By lunchtime, Green Lake Park was crowded with neighbors carrying flashlights and calling her name. Police dogs arrived around dusk. Their handlers led them in wide sweeps across the trails, through the brush, along the lake's edge. The dogs picked up a scent near the north parking lot, then lost it. 200 yards, then nothing. Just empty air. It was the same story repeated by every team. No torn fabric. No signs of a struggle. Just an ordinary morning turned into a void. Detective Frank Callahan arrived at the park that evening. He'd been pulled off another case, a robbery downtown. He stood by the taped-off lot, scanning the scene. He saw Margaret's car parked neatly between two others, doors locked, keys missing. Her favorite running shoes sat inside by the passenger seat, the newer pair she hadn't worn. Something about that detail stuck with him. Why take the old ones? He looked around at the trees, the water, the thick fog rolling off the lake. "This is where she stopped," he murmured. He didn't mean physically. He meant everything. That night, Paul sat in the living room with his mother and daughter. The TV showed live footage of the search flashlight beams cutting through mist. Emily asked if Mommy was on the screen. Paul told her no. He told her Mommy would be home soon. Then he went upstairs and shut the door, because he couldn't keep his voice steady anymore. Outside, volunteers worked until midnight. By morning, the search radius had widened 5 miles beyond the park. Every creek bed, every culvert, every empty shed was checked. Reporters swarmed the scene, their lights painting the fog blue. The words "missing nurse" appeared on every broadcast. Seattle felt smaller. People locked their doors early. Runners stopped wearing headphones. Fear crept into the routine like a shadow no one could shake. Detective Callahan stayed on the case around the clock. He walked the path himself at dawn the next day, tracing Margaret's usual loop, imagining her pace, her breath. He stopped near a bend, where the trail dipped toward a small creek. That was where the dogs had stopped. He crouched, examined the ground. Nothing but damp soil and fallen leaves. Still, he felt it that hum detectives get when they know they're standing in the right place. He ordered another grid search. Nothing turned up. Then, a tip came in. A woman named Evelyn Matsumoto, who lived across from the north lot, said she'd seen a dark-colored SUV parked there around 6 that morning. She thought the driver looked nervous, smoking, tapping the steering wheel, but she couldn't remember the license plate. Officer Renner took her statement and filed it. Somehow, it got buried misfiled under secondary leads. That single sheet of paper sat untouched for 29 years. By the end of the week, Margaret Voigt was front-page news. Beloved nurse vanishes during morning run. Her face smiling and her hospital ID photo was everywhere. The Seattle Times ran a story with a quote from her coworker, Linda Bergman. "She was the kind of person you wanted in your corner. I can't believe she's gone." The police set up a tip line. Calls poured in. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station in Renton. Another caller swore she was on a ferry to Bainbridge Island. None of it checked out. Callahan followed each lead, sleep-deprived and frustrated. He kept replaying the morning in his mind. The empty trail. The silent car. The missing woman who never made it past the first mile. For Emily, the days blurred together. She slept in her parents' bed for a while, clutching her stuffed rabbit. At school, teachers spoke in hushed voices. Some kids whispered that her mom was on the news. She stopped eating lunch. Stopped talking. Paul tried to keep the house running. Reporters called. Neighbors dropped off casseroles he didn't touch. At night, he sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker against the fog. Every car that passed made him look up, hoping. Every silence hurt more. He kept expecting the phone to ring with good news. It never did. By October, the search had slowed. Winter rain returned, washing away footprints and scent trails. Leads dried up. The news cycle moved on. Seattle, a city used to rain and forgetting, learned to live with another ghost. Detective Callahan refused to close the file. He kept her photo pinned above his desk, next to a note that read, "Find her." He told his captain, "This one's not over." His captain didn't argue, but the resources disappeared anyway. One fall morning a year later, while boxing up paperwork, Callahan found the misfiled witness statement about the blue blazer. He tried to chase it down, but the witness had passed away. Vehicle records were incomplete. The lead went nowhere. Still, that single image haunted him, a nervous man sitting in a dark SUV, smoking, watching the fog roll over the lake. For the Voigt family, life split into before and after. Paul kept Margaret's toothbrush on the sink, her coffee mug in the cabinet, her shoes by the door. He couldn't bring himself to move them. Every September 12th, he and Emily visited the lake, bringing white lilies. Sometimes strangers joined them. Most years, it was just the two of them standing by the water, waiting. Emily grew older, quieter. Her father grew old searching. And the city, with all its noise and new buildings, never gave her mother back. But time has a strange way of circling back. 30 years later, in a cold case lab south of Seattle, a detective named Ryan Sullivan would hold that same brown glove, the one found near the North Trail, cataloged and forgotten. He would look at the tag that read, Evidence 1991, and he would wonder why no one had tested it. Then he would send it to a lab that could find DNA invisible to the naked eye. That glove would speak, and the story of the last normal day would finally find its ending. When investigators talk about cold cases, they often say the same thing. The first 12 hours decide everything. For Detective Frank Callahan, those 12 hours began at 10:30 a.m. on September 12, 1990. That was when he first saw Margaret Voigt's car. A silver Honda Civic, parked neatly in the north lot of Green Lake Park, windows rolled up, doors locked, no signs of forced entry. It looked ordinary, almost serene until you noticed what wasn't there. No driver, no purse, no running shoes on the floorboard. Just a coffee cup in the cup holder, lipstick mark faint on the rim. Callahan crouched beside the car while a forensics tech dusted the door handle for prints. He could smell cedar and lake water, the distant hum of traffic from Aurora Avenue. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made crime feel impossible. "Any sign of a struggle?" he asked. The tech shook her head. "Nothing obvious." Callahan's partner, Detective Jim Foster, pointed toward the trail. "Dogs lost the scent about 200 yards out." Callahan nodded. He'd seen this pattern before, a woman abducted close to her vehicle, the scene too clean to be random. But Green Lake wasn't a place for ambushes. Too visible. Too busy, even in early morning fog. Unless whoever did this knew her route, knew her timing, knew exactly where to wait. By noon, the Seattle Police Department had declared a missing person with suspicious circumstances. That phrase mattered. It meant they weren't treating Margaret as someone who had wandered off. It meant foul play was on the table. Patrol cars fanned out around the park. Officers knocked on doors along East Green Lake Drive, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. Most hadn't. One jogger recalled a blue SUV idling near the lot around dawn, but he couldn't describe the driver. He thought it might belong to maintenance workers. Callahan wrote the detail in his notebook, blue SUV, possible blazer, 6 a.m., and underlined it twice. He didn't know then that it would vanish into a file cabinet for almost 3 decades. At home, Paul Voigt sat with a police sergeant and tried to replay the morning minute by minute. His memory was foggy, fragmented. He kept circling the same thought. She wouldn't just leave. He handed over a photo of Margaret, the same one later printed on flyers all over Seattle. In it, she's wearing her hospital scrubs, smiling with that small, tired grace nurses get from years of keeping calm for others. The photo didn't look like a crime victim. It looked like life. The sergeant asked the hard questions. Had they argued? Was she seeing anyone else? Had she ever mentioned feeling unsafe? Paul said no. No fights. No secrets. Just routine. The sergeant nodded politely, but Callahan's rule held true. The husband is always a person of interest. They took his statement, collected a few items of Margaret's clothing for the K9 units, and told him to stay by the phone. He waited there all day, answering calls from friends and family, every ring a surge of hope followed by the dull collapse of no news. At 2 in the afternoon, the forensics team finished processing the car. They found partial prints on the driver door, all belonging to Margaret, and one unidentified smudge on the rear passenger window. The smudge was too faint to lift. No fibers. No blood. No fingerprints of value. No sign of forced entry. The trunk was empty except for a first aid kit and a folded blanket. Her keys were gone. Her pepper spray was gone. Her life, it seemed, had evaporated. Callahan walked the path again, starting from the north lot. He counted his steps. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet leaves. He passed joggers, dog walkers, families pushing strollers. No one looked suspicious. Everyone looked normal. 200 yards in, the trail bent slightly toward a cluster of fir trees. That was where the scent dogs had stopped earlier. Callahan paused there. He looked down. Nothing but dirt and pine needles. Still, something about the spot pulled at him, that detective's instinct you can't quite put on paper. He radioed for another sweep. Volunteers joined the search, combing the underbrush in lines. They found a few stray items, a hair tie, a discarded water bottle, a candy wrapper, all unrelated. No clothing. No shoe prints that led anywhere. As night fell, the lights came out. Generators hummed. Search dogs whined in frustration. The fog rolled back in, swallowing the park in white. Reporters arrived before dark. They hovered near the tape, calling out questions. Callahan hated press days, the flashbulbs, the sound bites, the way tragedy became spectacle. Still, he gave them what he could. A woman, 34, missing since early morning. We are treating this as suspicious and are asking the public for any information. By the next morning, Margaret's photo was on every local broadcast. Inside the Green Lake Community Center, a command post took shape. Maps covered the tables. Coffee cups stacked in corners. Volunteers signed in and took search grids. The missing person bulletin described her as height 5'4", hair brown, eyes hazel. Last seen wearing gray sweatpants, green windbreaker, and white sneakers. The description ran on the radio hourly. Paul listened from home, each repeat sounding less like information and more like a prayer. That afternoon, a break, or what looked like one. A hiker found a single brown wool glove near a secondary trail, 50 yards off the main loop. It looked weathered, half buried in dirt. He handed it to an officer at the scene, who logged it as evidence but didn't think much of it. No blood. No obvious connection. Just another stray item in a park full of them. The glove was bagged, labeled, and stored. It would stay that way for 29 years. By the end of day 2, Callahan's face showed the fatigue that comes when logic fails. He'd done everything by the book: canvas, search grid, vehicle trace, phone records, interviews. Nothing. It was as if the park had opened up and swallowed her whole. He sat in his unmarked car, watching fog drift over the water, and said to no one in particular, "We're missing something." He was right. But he wouldn't know what until he was long retired. At home, Paul Voigt barely slept. He sat at the kitchen table, Margaret's coffee mug still beside him. Every creak in the house made him look up. Every car passing outside made him stand and check the window. At one point, around midnight, he stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was silent. Even the air felt still, heavy. He whispered, "Where are you, Mags?" There was no answer. Just the low, constant hiss of rain. By morning, the case had drawn citywide attention. The Seattle Times ran the headline, "Nurse Vanishes During Morning Run." TV crews interviewed volunteers, neighbors, co-workers. At Swedish Medical, Margaret's colleagues hung her photo near the nurse's station and lit candles below it. Detective Callahan stood in front of a map of the park, red pins marking search zones. He tapped the north lot with a pencil. "This is our anchor," he said. "She started here. The scent ends here. The car's here. So, what happened in this 100-yard stretch?" His partner shrugged. "Maybe she got into a car willingly." Callahan didn't buy it. Margaret wasn't the type to get in a stranger's vehicle. But she might have known the person. Or trusted them. That idea, trust as a weapon, would stick with him for the rest of his career. By the end of the first 72 hours, hope had started to fray. Reporters began using the past tense when they said her name. Volunteers dwindled. The scent dogs were called off. The lake returned to its calm reflection, as if nothing had ever happened there. The Voigt family was left in the silence that follows after everyone else has gone home. Paul stopped answering the phone. 7-year-old Emily asked fewer questions each day. In the evenings, she'd sit at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of her mother by the lake, stick figures, and blue water and fog made from gray crayon. Sometimes she'd leave the drawings on the front porch, like offerings. Detective Callahan filed his first major report that week. It ran 47 pages, timelines, witness lists, search maps, photos. He wrote his closing note in all caps: "Insufficient evidence at this time. Continue monitoring leads." He signed it, closed the file, and stared at Margaret's photo for a long time before leaving the office. The next morning, rain washed away the chalk marks left by the search teams. People went back to their routines. Joggers returned to the trail. The world kept turning. But somewhere in those first hours, in that narrow gap between 5:30 and 6:30 a.m., someone had changed the course of 2 lives forever. Margaret's, and the person who took her. That brown glove, half buried near the trail, would wait in silence for decades. It would travel through evidence rooms, audits, and relocations. And when technology finally caught up, it would speak. But for now, in 1990, it was just one more piece of overlooked truth in a case already beginning to cool. The morning after Margaret Voigt vanished, Seattle woke uneasy. The story led every newscast. A nurse, a mother, gone without a trace from the safest park in the city. Even before the sun came up, cars lined East Green Lake Drive, reporters staking out the trailhead with cameras fogged by drizzle. Detective Frank Callahan arrived before 6, coffee in one hand, rain slicker half-buttoned. He wasn't used to press this early. Usually the first 48 hours stayed quiet, private. But not this one. This case had already gripped the city by the throat. By 7 a.m., the search base at the Green Lake Community Center buzzed like a command post. Folding tables covered in maps and clipboards. Volunteers signing waivers, pinning orange ribbons to their jackets. The smell of brewed coffee and wet paper everywhere. Callahan stood on the steps, voice steady through a megaphone. "We're working a 3-mile radius from the north parking lot. We'll go over every trail, every piece of brush, every dock. No shortcuts, no wandering." His tone wasn't for effect, it was for control, because panic was already rippling through the crowd. Among the volunteers were nurses from Swedish Medical, students from the University of Washington, parents with kids in strollers. One woman clutched a copy of Margaret's missing flyer like a prayer card. Someone had written across the bottom in red marker, "Bring her home." The K9 teams arrived next. 3 German shepherds and a bloodhound named Cleo. Their handlers in dark blue jackets marked Seattle Police K9 Unit. They were given a sealed plastic bag containing one of Margaret's running shirts, lavender soap scent still faint on the fabric. Cleo pressed her nose into it and immediately pulled toward the north lot. She tracked fast, nose down, tail whipping. Volunteers followed at a distance, careful not to disturb the scent path. 200 yards, a bend in the trail, then nothing. The dog circled once, twice, sat down, and whined. Callahan's heart sank. Same place as before. Same invisible wall. He knelt beside the handler. "Nothing?" The man shook his head. "It's like she stepped off the earth." By mid-morning, the news helicopters arrived. Their rotors thumped over the lake, stirring the fog like gray smoke. Reporters shouted into microphones about the disappearance that's haunting Seattle. Onlookers gathered behind police tape, whispering theories. Stranger danger, serial predator. The husband, always the husband. Callahan ignored them. He was moving methodically, doing the old-school detective thing, talking to every vendor, every jogger, every fisherman. He found a groundskeeper named Tony Ramirez, who said he'd seen a dark SUV parked by the trees around 6. Blue, maybe black, looked like a blazer. Same description as the earlier tip. Callahan jotted it down again. He didn't know yet that this tiny overlap blue blazer, north lot, 6 a.m., was the truth trying to surface. At noon, rain came hard. Searchers kept going anyway. They waded through wet brush, calling her name until their voices went hoarse. Paul Voigt joined them, drenched, hollow-eyed, refusing to stop. He walked the loop again and again, convinced he'd find something everyone else had missed. An officer eventually led him back to the command post, worried he'd collapse. Paul sat on the steps, trembling, while a volunteer handed him a styrofoam cup of coffee he couldn't drink. His hands shook so badly the cup rattled against his knee. He stared out at the fog and said quietly, "She's out there. I know she is." The Voigt house that evening looked like a command center of its own. Phones ringing non-stop. Family members huddled in corners, watching the news on mute. Margaret's co-workers dropped off casseroles, plates of food nobody touched. Emily sat on the couch hugging her stuffed rabbit, asking when her mother was coming home. No one had an answer. At the precinct, Callahan's desk overflowed with statements. By the end of day 2, he'd logged more than 60 tips. Most were dead-end sightings that fell apart on first call. But one stood out. A woman reported hearing a car door slam near the lake around 6:15, followed by what she thought was a shout. It had been faint, carried on the fog, but sharp enough to make her turn. She'd seen nothing else. The sound had come from the direction of the north lot. Callahan built his first working theory. Margaret finished her run or stopped to stretch near her car. Someone approached, maybe someone she knew. There was a brief confrontation. She was forced, or tricked, into another vehicle. Gone within seconds. The problem: no witnesses. No security cameras in 1990. No cell phone pings. Just silence. Still, Callahan wrote it down. Possible abduction near vehicle between 6:15 and 6:30. He added one more line beneath it: blue blazer suspect vehicle. By the 4th day, the community response had reached fever pitch. The Seattle Times ran a full-page spread with Margaret's photo under the headline, "Missing Nurse's Family Pleads for Help." Television crews filmed from boats on the lake, narrating the search. Local pastors organized prayer vigils. High school track teams ran in her honor. Green Lake wasn't just a park anymore, it was a shrine. And with that came the darker side. Rumors. Some said she'd been having an affair with a doctor at the hospital. Others claimed she'd been targeted by a stalker patient's family. None of it true, but gossip fills the void faster than facts ever can. By the end of the week, the whispers reached Paul. They broke him. He stopped answering the phone entirely. Callahan could feel the case slipping. Every detective knows the curve the moment when public sympathy starts to fade, when search parties thin, and the missing poster becomes just another piece of weathered paper on a pole. He worked the leads hard anyway. He interviewed a drifter found sleeping near the park, questioned Margaret's ex-boyfriend in Spokane, even tested the janitorial staff at Swedish Medical for prints. Nothing matched. One night, exhausted, he walked alone around Green Lake. The trail was empty, the air cold. He stopped near the bend where the dogs had lost the scent. Moonlight glinted on wet pavement. He stood there for a long time, listening to the water lap against the shore. "Where are you?" he whispered into the dark. No answer came, but he kept asking. On day 10, the official search ended. Too many hours. Too few leads. The department couldn't justify the overtime. The command post was dismantled. Volunteers went home. The park reopened to joggers. Callahan stayed behind with one other detective, taping off the last section of trail. He walked it once more, flashlight scanning the ground. At one point, the beam caught something small, a cigarette butt half buried in the dirt near the edge of the lot. He bagged it automatically. No one thought much of it. Everyone smoked back then. The item was labeled unrelated debris and shelved with the rest. It would stay sealed for 35 years. Back at home, Paul Voigt's mother moved in to help with Emily. The house felt smaller, quieter, filled with the ghost weight of routines Margaret used to run. The smell of her perfume lingered in the hallway for weeks, fading slowly until one day it didn't. Paul started leaving a lamp on in the front window, a signal he refused to explain. Neighbors began to avoid eye contact. People don't know what to say to grief that doesn't end. By October, Callahan's captain wanted the case scaled back. "No body, no suspect, no movement," he said. Callahan argued, but protocol was protocol. He packed the evidence into 3 boxes: statements, photographs, physical items. He labeled them Green Lake Case 1990, Voight, and stored them in the precinct basement. He thought it would be temporary. It wasn't. Over the next year, the city changed. Grunge bands took over the clubs downtown. Traffic thickened. New faces replaced old ones. But for the people who lived around Green Lake, time barely moved. Every foggy morning looked like the one she disappeared into. They kept telling the story to newcomers, the nurse who went for a jog and never came home. It became Seattle's quiet ghost tale, a warning wrapped in small talk. Detective Callahan carried the file through 3 promotions. He'd open it once a year, reread the notes, stare at the photo of her car in the fog. Each time, he'd tell himself he'd missed something. Some small thing that could bring her back. He didn't know it yet, but that small thing, the brown wool glove and the cigarette butt logged as debris, already held the answer. The city just wasn't ready to hear it. By the 3rd week, the search for Margaret Voight had stopped being a rescue and started being a reckoning. The press still used the word missing, but everyone else whispered dead. Detective Frank Callahan hated that word. He refused to write it in his reports. He still believed she might be alive somewhere, taken, hidden, waiting. But deep down, even he could feel the tone of the case shifting from urgency to aftermath. And when a case tips like that, something else starts to take its place. Rumor. It began at the hospital. Someone told a reporter that Margaret had been acting distracted in the days before she vanished. A friend of a friend said she'd been seen talking to a man in a dark car outside the hospital parking lot. The Seattle Times ran it as a sidebar. Missing nurse may have had secret troubles. It was nothing but speculation, but once printed, it stuck. Her co-workers were furious. Her charge nurse, Linda Bergman, called the newsroom to complain. But the damage was done. People wanted a reason. The truth was too random. So they made one up. Back at the precinct, Callahan followed every new lead that came in from the publicity storm. A truck driver claimed he'd seen a woman matching Margaret's description hitchhiking near Everett. Another caller said she was spotted in a diner outside Olympia, sitting alone, drinking coffee. None of it checked. No fingerprints, no witnesses who could confirm. The local radio stations ran segments on the Green Lake Mystery, and self-proclaimed psychics began calling the department. They always had visions of water, trees, darkness. Nothing useful. But the tip that haunted Callahan came from a name he almost recognized, Evelyn Matsumoto, 73 years old, who lived across from the north parking lot. She said she'd seen a vehicle that morning, a blue or black Chevrolet Blazer. Driver male, white, mid-30s, smoking, tapping the steering wheel like he was nervous. She hadn't seen anyone approach him, and after a few minutes, she went inside. The report was filed by Officer David Renner. It should have been routed to Callahan's desk that same day. It wasn't. For reasons no one ever explained, it was misfiled under secondary inquiries and forgotten. By the time Callahan found it a year later, Evelyn had died of a stroke. The one clear lead had literally gone to the grave. In those weeks after the disappearance, Callahan interviewed dozens of people. Co-workers, ex-boyfriends, distant relatives, even the man who ran the coffee stand near the trail. Everyone said the same thing. Margaret was steady, kind, predictable. No enemies. No drama. The perfect victim for someone who needed invisibility because no one like her should have gone missing. He brought in James Lindstrom, a mechanic whose mother had been one of Margaret's oncology patients. 6 months earlier, he'd made comments to her personal, inappropriate. She'd reported it, and the hospital had banned him from the ward. Callahan grilled him for 2 hours. Lindstrom denied everything, said he barely remembered her. His alibi was shaky, but without evidence, Callahan couldn't hold him. Still, he kept Lindstrom's name circled in his notes. Then there was the ex-boyfriend, David Crane, now married with a baby in Spokane. Callahan drove out there, asked a dozen questions, checked the timeline. Crane had been at a pharmaceutical conference in Portland the day Margaret vanished. Receipts and witnesses confirmed it. Another door closed. Weeks turned into months. By November, the case file had tripled in size but held no answers. Callahan filled out the first inactive pending new information, form a bureaucratic way of saying we're out of leads. He hated every word of it. He left the case status box blank for 2 days before finally checking cold. For Paul Voigt, life blurred into survival mode. Detectives stopped coming by. Reporters moved on to other stories. Friends stopped calling not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what to say. Grief makes people uncomfortable. He went back to work part-time because bills still existed. But he couldn't walk past Green Lake anymore. He'd drive the long way around just to avoid seeing it. His daughter, Emily, stopped asking when her mother would come home. She just asked if she could leave the porch light on at night. Paul said yes. The light stayed on for years. Callahan visited the Voigt house every few months just to check in. He'd sit with Paul in silence, both men staring at the same framed photo on the mantel, Margaret, holding Emily at the beach, laughing into the wind. They didn't talk about the case much. There wasn't anything new to say. Once, Paul asked, "Do you think she suffered?" Callahan didn't answer. He didn't have to. By the spring of 1991, the department officially archived the Green Lake case. The 3 boxes went to the evidence room in the basement, case number 90-472. Callahan still visited them from time to time, as if the answers might appear if he stared long enough. That summer, he found something he didn't remember seeing before a small plastic bag in the evidence box marked miscellaneous. Inside was the brown wool glove, stiff with dried dirt. The tag read, "Found near secondary trail, the 15th of September 2090. No analysis conducted." He held it up to the light, frowned, then put it back. There was nothing to test, no blood, no body to match it to. It was just another fragment of a day gone wrong. He didn't know that the glove would one day be the thing that cracked the case open. The following years passed like pages turning themselves. A body was never found. Every new missing person case brought Margaret's name back for a headline or two, then faded again. The city changed around her absence. Grunge bands played in clubs that hadn't existed when she vanished. Starbucks went national. Seattle got busier, shinier. But Green Lake stayed the same, damp, quiet, beautiful, haunted. Every September 12th, Paul and Emily returned to the park. They stood near the north lot and laid white lilies on the ground. Reporters sometimes showed up, sometimes didn't. It didn't matter. The ritual was for them, not the cameras. Paul always said the same thing before leaving: "We're still waiting." For Detective Callahan, the case never left. He retired in 2003, moved to Spokane to be near his grandkids, but he kept a copy of the file's front page in his desk drawer. Some nights he'd take it out, read the date, and whisper the same question he'd asked on that foggy trail decades earlier. "Where are you, Margaret?" Inside the Seattle Police Department, the cold case boxes sat through multiple reorganizations, budget cuts, digital conversions. Evidence was barcoded, logged, scanned, forgotten. The glove stayed sealed. So did the small envelope marked unrelated debris, the one containing the cigarette butt found near her car. It would take a new generation of detectives, raised in a world where DNA spoke louder than witnesses, to finally open it again. But back in 1991, none of that existed yet. Just paper. Just memory. Just the stubborn belief that someone out there still knew the truth. And one person did. A man living quietly, smoking cigarettes on his porch in Tacoma. A man who'd once driven a dark blue Chevrolet Blazer. A man who thought 30 years was long enough for secrets to stay buried. He was wrong. When the verdict came down, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts. Raymond Hoffman didn't flinch. He sat there, hands folded, the same quiet shell of a man who'd once blended into Seattle's gray background like another piece of fog. The sentence: 40 years in prison. He would die behind bars. Justice, by legal measure, was done. But for Emily Voigt, justice didn't feel like peace. It felt like exhaustion, like the end of a storm that had lasted her entire life. She was 41 now, older than her mother had ever been. She sat in the front row during sentencing, her hands clasped in her lap, her stepmother Susan beside her. She'd listened to every word of testimony: the DNA match, the genealogy tree, the confession, the lies. She'd seen the photos of the glove that started it all, sealed in its yellowed plastic bag, still carrying her mother's ghost. And now, as the gavel fell, she realized something. Closure isn't clean. It's jagged. It cuts both ways, After the trial, reporters swarmed outside the courthouse. Emily didn't stop for interviews. She walked straight to her car, head down, clutching the same photo of her mother she'd carried since she was 7 years old. Her voice shook when she finally spoke to a detective waiting nearby, Ryan Sullivan, the man who had reopened the case. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "It was time," he replied. Neither of them said the other truth out loud, that time had taken too much already. That night, Seattle's news stations called it the end of a 34-year mystery. Cold case solved. DNA justice. Another success story for forensic genealogy. But behind the headlines was something quieter. Detectives still hadn't found Margaret's remains. Hoffman's confession gave only a vague location, the foothills east of Snohomish, somewhere near old logging roads long since overgrown. Search teams went out for weeks, combing through acres of moss and pine. They found scraps of rusted tools, bottles, lost shoes, but not her. The forest had reclaimed its secret. Every detective involved knew what that meant. Cases like this rarely end with neat resolution. There's always one piece that refuses to fit. One question that stays unsolved. For the Voigt family, that question was where. Where did he leave her? Where could they lay flowers that weren't just symbolic? In her victim impact statement, Emily had told Hoffman, "You took away our goodbye." Now, that line hung over the case like the last word of an unfinished sentence. For Detective Ryan Sullivan, the case became both his greatest success and his heaviest burden. He'd solved it with science, with data, DNA, and patience, but the human part of him couldn't stop thinking about the gap that remained. He'd played the confession tape a dozen times, hoping for a clue in Hoffman's voice, a phrase that might pinpoint the site. There was none. Just that flat tone, and the line Sullivan would never forget. It was an accident. He didn't believe it. No one did. Predators always find softer words for what they've done. Months later, in early spring, Emily returned to Green Lake. The same park. The same loop her mother had run. The fog was thin that morning, sunlight breaking through in strips. She walked the trail slowly, stopping at the bend where the dogs had lost the scent all those years ago. There was a new memorial there, now small, discreet, installed by the city. A bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Margaret Voigt, 1956-1990. Beloved mother, nurse, and neighbor. Missing, but not forgotten." She knelt beside it, placed a single white lily, and whispered, "We found him, Mom." She stayed there until the fog burned off. Across town, in a windowless prison cell, Raymond Hoffman sat alone. He spent his days cleaning laundry, eating quietly, saying little. He didn't appeal his sentence. When asked by a prison counselor why he finally confessed after 34 years, he said something that made the counselor write it down twice. "You can only hold your breath for so long." But he never gave the location. Even when his health began to fail, he stayed silent. It was the last power he had to decide what the world would never know. In March of 2027, he died of natural causes in his cell. No family claimed the body. He was buried in the prison cemetery under a simple marker, R.H. 1951, 2027. The man who had stolen a life now lay under a number instead of a name. When Emily heard the news, she felt nothing. No relief. No satisfaction. Just the quiet understanding that some endings aren't justice, they're just endings. She went back to Green Lake that evening. The air smelled of rain and cedar, same as it had on the morning her mother disappeared. She sat on a bench overlooking the water and took out her phone. She played a voicemail she'd saved from years earlier, a recording of Detective Sullivan calling the day they arrested Hoffman. "We have him," his voice said. "It's over." But it wasn't really over. Not completely. Today, when you walk around Green Lake Park, the joggers still move along that same loop. Dogs splash in the shallows. Kids ride bikes along the paved path. There's nothing to tell you that this was once the center of one of Seattle's longest unsolved cases. Only those who stop to read the plaque know. Every September 12th, at dawn, one woman leaves a small bouquet of lilies there. No cameras. No ceremony. Just a daughter keeping a promise. She doesn't say her mother's name out loud anymore, she doesn't have to. The city remembers her now. The file is closed. The case is taught at the academy, as a model of perseverance and forensic science. But if you ask the detectives who worked it, they'll tell you something else. Solving a case doesn't mean ending it. Some cases never end. They just fade into the fog, waiting for the next morning to rise. In one of Hoffman's storage boxes recovered from his Tacoma garage, detectives found a set of old Polaroid photographs, water-damaged, warped from age. Most were blank or overexposed. But one showed a narrow forest road, sunlight cutting through trees, a small shape at the edge of the frame, the corner of a tarp, half buried under pine needles. Forensic analysts couldn't locate where it was taken. The photo had no timestamp, no coordinates, no context. Only a faint handprint in the corner, pressed in dirt before the film dried. It was Margaret's. That's where the story stops. The mystery of where remains. But the mystery of who is gone forever. And on quiet Seattle mornings, when the fog rolls in from Puget Sound and clings to the trees around Green Lake, people still swear the park feels different, as if it remembers. Every September 12th, dawn falls soft over Green Lake, the air cool and heavy with fog. The water lies still, and the cedar trees hold the same quiet they did in 1990. Few who jog the loop that morning remember the name Margaret Voigt, but the park does. It always has. Her daughter, Emily, still comes at sunrise. She parks in the north lot, the same place her mother did all those years ago. In her hands, she carries a single white lily. She kneels beside the small bronze plaque near the trail, the one that reads, "Missing but not forgotten," and sets the flower beneath her mother's name. She doesn't linger. She whispers something private, stands, and walks the same 3-mile loop her mother once ran every Wednesday. Around her, the city hums awake. Buses rumble on Aurora Avenue. Dogs tug at leashes. Life moves on, as it always has, but here the air feels different. The mist seems to hold its breath a little longer, as if listening for footsteps that never finish their run. Raymond Hoffman is gone now, buried under a numbered marker in the prison yard. His name faded from headlines years ago. The detectives who solved the case have moved on too, but the photo of a brown wool glove still hangs in the cold case unit, a reminder of the day science caught up to time. For Emily, closure never came in the courtroom. Justice maybe, but not peace. Peace would have meant finding her mother, bringing her home. Instead, the forest east of Seattle still keeps its secret, and the unanswered question lingers like fog over the lake. Where is she? Some nights, when rain taps against her window, Emily dreams of her mother running steady, calm, face turned toward the water. In the dream, she always looks back once, smiling, before the mist swallows her whole. And when Emily wakes, she reminds herself that her mother's story no longer belongs only to loss. It belongs to memory, to persistence, to a city that refused to forget a nurse who vanished on an ordinary morning. Now, when strangers stop to read the plaque by the trail, they might not know the whole story. They might not know about the glove, the DNA, or the man who thought time would hide what he'd done. But they pause long enough to see her name, and that's enough. The fog rolls in again. The sun climbs higher. The world moves forward. But on mornings when the lake is still and the air smells faintly of cedar and rain, it feels as though Margaret Voigt is still there, forever running into the mist.